The moment Cornelius Wallace rode onto the Mercer spread with dust on his boots and honest work in his eyes. He had no idea that the most important decision of his life would be made not by a handshake with the old man, but by the woman who watched him from the kitchen window with flour on her hands and fire in her gaze. It was the spring of 1878, and the Texas Panhandle was a place that demanded everything from a man and gave back only what he could take with his own two hands. The land stretched wide and golden under a sky so vast it made a person feel small and infinite all at once, the kind of country that broke weak men and forged strong ones into something almost holy. Cattle drives were still the lifeblood of the region, and the Kishom Trail ran like a scar of commerce through the heart of it all, connecting the ranches of Texas to the railheads of Kansas with a thread of dust and ambition. Cornelius Wallace was 26 years old, broad-shouldered and lean in the way that comes from years of honest labor rather than vanity. He had dark hair that curled slightly at his collar when it grew too long, and gray eyes that had the unsettling quality of seeing straight through pretense to whatever was real underneath. He had been working cattle since he was old enough to sit a horse, had driven 3 trail runs north to Abilene before the railroad moved the market south, and had developed a reputation among ranchers from the Red River to the Canadian as a man who kept his word, kept his crew in order, and kept his fists to himself unless there was no other option. He had come to the Mercer Ranch because he had heard from a man in Tascosa that old Elias Mercer was looking for a foreman, and because the winter had been particularly unforgiving and Cornelius had spent it working odd jobs in town, mending fences and hauling freight, and he was hungry again for something with roots. A foreman position was different from trail work. It meant staying put. It meant building something. And Cornelius Wallace, though he would not have said it aloud to another soul on earth, was tired of being a man who belonged nowhere. The Mercer Ranch sat on a sweep of rolling grassland about 18 miles northeast of the town of Amarillo, which in 1878 was still more a collection of intentions than a proper settlement, the railroad not yet having arrived to give it permanence. The ranch house itself was a solid structure of planed lumber and adobe brick, low to the ground and wide across its face, with a covered porch that ran the full length of the front and deep-set windows that kept out the worst of the summer heat. There were 3 good barns, a bunkhouse that could sleep 12, a smokehouse, a root cellar, and a garden plot behind the house that showed evidence of serious and practiced care. Elias Mercer met him in the yard before Cornelius had fully dismounted, which told Cornelius something about the man right away. He was the kind of rancher who had not forgotten what it meant to be on horseback himself, who watched the approach of a stranger with the calm assessment of someone who knew exactly how much depended on his own judgment. He was somewhere north of 60, thick through the chest and shoulders, with a white mustache that he kept trimmed and gray eyes that had clearly passed themselves along to at least one of his children. "You Wallace," Elias said, not offering his hand yet. "Yes, sir." Cornelius Wallace, out of the Canadian River country originally, most recently out of Tascosa. "I heard about you from Jim Prout. He said you ran his remuda north in '75 without losing a single head." "We lost 2 horses to a creek crossing outside of Caldwell. I don't count that a perfect run." Elias looked at him steadily for a moment. Then he offered his hand. "A man who won't lie about his record is a man I can use. Come in and eat something. We'll talk about what I need." That was when Cornelius first saw Hazel Mercer, though he did not know her name yet. She appeared in the doorway of the ranch house with a dish towel over one shoulder, and an expression that suggested she had formed an opinion already, and was simply waiting to see if it would need revising. She was 22 years old, though she carried herself with a kind of settled certainty that could have belonged to a woman 10 years her senior. She had her father's gray eyes and dark brown hair that she wore pinned up in the practical manner of a woman who worked hard and had no patience for things that got in the way of that work. She was slender but not delicate, the sort of person whose strength lived in her hands and her spine rather than in any obvious show of it. She looked at Cornelius once, directly, the way a person looks at something they mean to understand, and then she stepped back inside without a word. Cornelius followed Elias into the house and ate the meal that Hazel set on the table without fanfare, dried beef and pinto beans and cornbread that was still warm from the oven, and coffee so dark and strong it could have stripped the paint from a barn door. He ate with the careful restraint of a man raised to be grateful for what was set before him, and he noticed that Hazel moved through the kitchen and the dining room with an efficiency that was almost musical, every motion purposeful, nothing wasted. She did not speak to him through the meal. She answered her father's questions about the afternoon's tasks with brief precision and refilled his coffee without being asked. But Cornelius was aware of her in the way a man is aware of a fire in a cold room, not staring at it but always knowing where it is. Elias told him what the foreman position entailed. There were currently 460 head of longhorn cattle on the property, with expectations of expanding to 700 by the following spring. There were 8 ranch hands, 2 of whom were brothers and reliable, 3 of whom were new hires of uncertain quality, and 3 of whom were solid men who had been with the Mercer outfit for years. The foreman's responsibilities would include managing all of the hands, overseeing breeding and culling decisions, coordinating with the local cattle buyers, maintaining the infrastructure of the ranch, and reporting directly to Elias himself. "I'll pay you $35 a month and a room in the house," Elias said. "Not the bunkhouse, the room off the back. My wife passed 3 years ago and it's been sitting empty." "That's a generous offer," Cornelius said. He did not say yes yet because he wanted to walk the land first, and he said so. Elias nodded approvingly. "Tomorrow morning, I'll show you myself." That night Cornelius slept in the bunkhouse with the hands, not having been given the back room yet, and he lay in the dark listening to the sound of Texas at night, the coyotes testing the edges of the ranch, the wind through the grass, the creak of the old structure settling around them. He thought about the ranch and what it would take to build it into what Elias wanted. He thought, very briefly and without meaning to, about gray eyes in a doorway. In the morning, he walked the land with Elias from sunup until the middle of the day, and what he saw confirmed that the man knew how to pick ground. The grass was good. There were 2 reliable water sources. The fencing was solid where it existed, though much of the outer range was still open. There was a section to the northeast that Elias had not yet brought fully into production, about 300 acres of tall grass that had been left to recover from an overgrazed patch the previous owner had left behind, and Cornelius could see the potential in it. "You can make this work," Cornelius said, and he meant it, and because Elias was the kind of man who could tell the difference between empty encouragement and genuine assessment, they shook hands before they got back to the house, and the thing was settled. He moved into the back room that afternoon. It was plain and clean, with a single window that looked out over the garden, a narrow iron bed, a washstand, a small writing desk, and hooks on the wall for his gear. It was more than he had had in years, and he was aware of that without sentimentality. He met Hazel properly on his 3rd day on the property. He had been out since before dawn working with 2 of the hands to repair a section of fence that the winter had pulled apart, and he came back to the house in the early afternoon to find her in the garden, kneeling in the dirt between rows of young bean plants with a trowel in her hand and complete concentration on her face. The garden was larger than he had first realized, with a kitchen section near the house and what looked like a herb plot and a flower section further along. She had grown up in this garden, he could tell by the way she moved in it. He stopped at the edge of the garden because walking through it seemed rude, and he was trying to get back to his room without bothering anyone. "You can walk around the south side," she said without looking up. "The path is clear." I didn't want to interrupt. She sat back on her heels and looked at him then, with that same direct quality she had shown in the doorway. "You are not interrupting anything. The beans will not care either way." He smiled at that in spite of himself, a real smile, not the careful professional expression he wore around Elias. "I am Cornelius Wallace." "I know who you are," she said. "I am Hazel Mercer. You are sleeping in the room that has the best view of my garden. Should I apologize for that? Not unless you intend to stare out of it at odd hours." "I am usually asleep by 8 and up before 4, he said. "You are unlikely to have cause for complaint." She studied him for a moment with an expression he could not quite read, and then she nodded once, which seemed to be a form of provisional acceptance, and she turned back to her beans. He went around the south side of the garden, as she had indicated, and thought about her for the rest of the afternoon in the careful way a sensible man thinks about something that he suspects might matter. The weeks that followed were consumed by the work of the ranch, which was enormous and satisfying in the way that hard, purposeful work always is. Cornelius established himself quickly among the hands, not by assertion, but by demonstration. He rode harder than any of them, stayed out later in bad weather, could diagnose a sick animal faster than the nearest livestock man in Amarillo, and had an instinct for the movement of cattle that the older hands respected without needing to say so. The 3 uncertain new hires either improved under his expectation or collected their wages and moved on, which was exactly the right outcome. He saw Hazel every day. It was impossible not to, given the size of the household and the rhythm of ranch life. She cooked the midday meal and the evening meal for the house, which in practice meant for her father, for Cornelius, and for whichever of the hands came in from the immediate vicinity. She managed the garden and the root cellar and the smokehouse with systematic intelligence, and she also, he discovered with some surprise, kept the ranch accounts. He discovered this on a Tuesday evening in early May when he came into the house to report to Elias about the northeastern section, and found Hazel at the dining table with the ledgers open and a sharpened pencil in her hand, going through figures with the absorbed focus of someone who found numbers genuinely interesting. "Your father is not in?" he asked. "He rode to town this afternoon. He will be back tomorrow." She did not look up. "If you have something to report, you can report it to me. I manage the books." He sat down across from her without being invited, which was forward of him, but she did not seem to object. "I wanted to talk about the cost of the additional fencing for the northeast section." "What are you estimating?" He told her the figures he had worked out, the length of fence required, the cost of wire and posts at current prices in Amarillo, the labor. She listened with the pencil moving, not writing his words but thinking alongside them, and when he finished she looked up and said, "That is less than I expected. How did you calculate the post count?" He told her. She asked 3 more questions, none of them soft ones. He answered each one with the same straightforwardness she was giving him, and at the end of it she wrote a number in the ledger and said, "I will bring it to my father when he returns. He will want to approve any expenditure over $50. "Of course," Cornelius said. He did not get up right away. There was something about sitting across a table from her and talking about real things that he was reluctant to leave. "You have been doing these books for a while." "Since I was 17. My mother taught me, and then she got sick and I took it over." She said it without self-pity, as a plain fact. "My father is a great rancher, but numbers make his eyes cross. My father was the same way. Better with cattle than with anything that required a pen." She looked at him with a flicker of something, not warmth exactly, but interest, the kind a person shows when they realize someone else has an interior life worth paying attention to. "Where is your father now?" "Dead, 14 years ago. A bad winter when I was 12. He said it with the practiced steadiness of an old grief. "My mother had gone 2 years before that. I was raised by my father's brother until I was old enough to work, and then I worked." "I am sorry," she said, and she meant it, he could tell. She had the directness that does not waste expressions of sympathy on ceremony. "It made me what I am," he said. "Most things do." She held his gaze for a moment that stretched a beat longer than polite conversation required, and then she looked back down at the ledger. "Good night, Mr. Wallace." "Good night, Miss Mercer." He went to his room and lay on the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling and thought that the month of May was shaping up to be considerably more interesting than he had anticipated. He began to find reasons to be in the house in the evenings. He was not proud of it exactly, but he was not ashamed of it either. He would come in from the day's work, eat supper with Elias and Hazel, and instead of going immediately to the bunkhouse yard where the hands gathered after dark to play cards and tell stories, he would linger at the table over a second cup of coffee, finding things to discuss with Elias about the ranch. Elias liked to talk about cattle and land and the old days, and Cornelius was genuinely interested, so it was not false. But it was also true that Hazel was usually at the table too, finishing her own coffee, or mending, or sometimes reading one of the novels she ordered through the dry goods store from a bookseller in Kansas City. She was reading one such book on a Thursday evening in late May when Elias excused himself early with a headache, and suddenly Cornelius and Hazel were alone at the table with the lamp between them and the sound of the spring wind outside. She did not put the book down immediately. She finished her paragraph, which he appreciated. Then she set a thumb between the pages and looked at him. "You stay later in the evenings than you need to," she said. It was not an accusation. It was just the truth, laid out with her characteristic directness. He felt heat move up the back of his neck, but he kept his expression steady. "I find the company agreeable," he said. "The company has been your employer and his daughter," she said. "That seems like an unusual preference for a man who could be playing cards in the yard. I am not much of a card player." "Is that the only reason?" He considered lying, which took about half a second before he decided against it. Lying to Hazel Mercer seemed like a uniquely pointless enterprise. "No," he said, "it is not the only reason." She looked at him for a long moment, that measuring look she had, and then something in her face shifted in a way that was small but definite, the way a door shifts when someone's hand first touches the latch. "You should know," she said carefully, "that I am not the kind of woman who responds well to being pursued in a roundabout fashion." "I am not pursuing you in a roundabout fashion," he said. "I am sitting at your table and drinking your coffee and being honest when you ask me direct questions." "That is fair," she conceded. She opened her book again, and then she said without looking up, "The coffee will be ready at 5:30 tomorrow morning if you would like some before you ride out." She had never offered him early coffee before. He understood what it meant. "I will be there," he said. He was, and so was she, and they drank their coffee in the pre-dawn silence of the kitchen and talked about small things, the state of the grass after the spring rains, the progress of the garden, a hawk's nest she had spotted in one of the old cottonwoods along the creek. It was nothing extraordinary. It was everything. That became the pattern of their mornings through June, the two of them in the kitchen before the house fully woke, talking in the unguarded way that people talk when the rest of the world is still asleep. He learned that she had a mind like a well-made tool, precise and strong, that she had educated herself far beyond what the local school could offer by reading everything she could get her hands on, that she had an opinion on most subjects, and did not soften it for the convenience of whoever she was talking to. He told her about the trail drives, the landscape of Kansas, the way the light looked over the Oklahoma territory at evening, the things he had seen and done in 15 years of riding for wages. She asked questions about those years with genuine curiosity, not the polite kind but the kind that suggested she was building a picture and wanted it to be accurate. She asked about the Cheyenne territory, about the cattle towns, about the men he had known. He told her honestly, including the parts that were not flattering, the times he had made wrong choices, the winter he had drunk too much whiskey in Dodge City and lost 2 months to it before pulling himself back, the friend he had left behind in a Kansas City hospital because he had not had the money to stay, and the friend had recovered eventually and never blamed him for going. She listened to all of it without flinching. She did not offer absolution or judgment. She just listened, and that was worth more to him than he could easily say. In the middle of June, Elias Mercer told Cornelius that he wanted to invite him to a supper that was not an ordinary supper. He said it in the afternoon, standing by the corral fence, in a voice that had a different quality to it than his usual rancher's practicality. "You know I think highly of your work," Elias said. "I appreciate that, sir. The ranch is doing better than it has since before my wife took ill. The hands are steady, the accounts are in order, and you got that northeast section producing ahead of schedule." He paused. "You are also a good man. I have had enough time to know the difference." Cornelius waited because there was clearly more. "Hazel is 22, Elias said. "She has had offers before and she has turned them all down, which I have respected because she has good sense. But she is the only family I have, and I will not always be here, and I want her settled with someone I trust." He looked out over the ranch with the expression of a man laying out a hand of cards he has been holding for a while. "I would like to offer you her hand, Wallace. You would inherit half the ranch when I am gone, and there is a good life here if you want it." Cornelius heard him out completely, standing still in the afternoon sun with his hat in his hand, and he was quiet for a full 10 seconds before he said, "I am grateful for the offer, Mr. Mercer. Genuinely. You are a man I respect, and this ranch is the finest piece of ground I have ever had the privilege of working." Elias looked at him. "I hear about forming." "No, but," Cornelius said, "just this. If I am going to ask Hazel Mercer to be my wife, I will ask her myself. I would not have it any other way." Elias stared at him for a long moment. Then slowly something in the older man's face changed, moved from surprise into something that might have been respect and something else that was warmer than that. "You are right," he said quietly. "Her mother would have said the same thing to me if I had tried to arrange it." He cleared his throat. "She is in the garden." "I know where she is," Cornelius said. He put his hat back on and he walked around the south side of the house, along the path she had shown him that first day, and he found Hazel kneeling between the bean rows exactly as she had been on the afternoon they first properly spoke. The garden was in its full summer splendor now, the beans heavy on their poles, the tomatoes coming along, the squash sprawling at the southern end, the flowers that she grew not for practicality, but simply because she loved them spilling their color along the western border. She looked up when she heard his boots on the path, and she read something in his face immediately, which did not surprise him. She stood up, brushing dirt from her hands on her apron. "My father talked to you," she said. "He did." Her jaw set. "He had no right to. He offered me your hand," Cornelius said. "I told him I would ask you myself." The set of her jaw changed. Something moved through her face that was complicated and layered, the flash of anger at being managed fading into something much quieter and much more significant. She stood in the garden in the full June sun with dirt on her hands and looked at him. "You told him that," she said. "I told him that." She was quiet for a moment that felt enormous, the kind of moment that gets preserved in the memory in precise detail. The smell of the warm earth and the green growing things, the sound of the wind in the cottonwoods by the creek, the way the light caught the dust motes above the bean rows. "You have not asked me anything yet," she said. He took a step closer, so that they were no longer separated by the width of a row, but by something much smaller, the distance that two people who have been circling toward each other for 2 months finally allow to collapse. "I am asking now," he said, "not because your father wants it and not because of the ranch. Because I have spent 2 months talking to you in the morning and sitting across from you at that table and thinking about you when I am out working, and I believe you are the finest person I have ever known. And I know that is a plain way to put something that I feel considerably more strongly than plain, but I am not a man who speaks in flourishes. I am not a woman who wants flourishes," she said. "Then I will say it plainly. Hazel Mercer, I would like very much to be your husband if that is something you want. If it is not, I will respect that, and I will keep working this ranch as well as I can, and I will not trouble you about it again." She looked at him with those gray eyes that had seen straight through every pretense he had ever inadvertently put up, and she said, "I have been hoping you would ask me since the evening in May when you told me I was not the only reason you stayed late at the table." The simplicity of it, after all the careful orbiting, struck him like a match on a dry day. He laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes from genuine feeling rather than social courtesy, and she laughed too. And just for a moment the two of them stood in the garden in the afternoon sun and laughed together like people who have just discovered they have been solving the same problem from opposite sides. Then he reached out and took her hand, the one with the dirt still on it from the garden, and she did not pull it back, and they stood there holding hands between the bean rows like the most natural thing in the world. "Yes," she said. "My answer is yes." They were married in September of 1878, on a morning when the Panhandle air had finally begun to cool from its summer ferocity, and the sky was the particular deep blue that only occurs in that country in early autumn. The ceremony was held at the ranch because the church in Amarillo was small, and the traveling minister who served the region had no objection to coming out to the Mercer land, and because Hazel preferred it there. She said she did not want to get married somewhere she had never been before, and Cornelius thought that was exactly the right instinct. She wore her mother's dress, which she had altered herself over the summer evenings while Cornelius was doing his best not to notice her bent over the fabric with pins in her mouth and concentration on her face. The dress was ivory cotton with small blue flowers embroidered at the collar and cuffs, simple and right for her. She walked out of the house on her father's arm, and Cornelius watched her come across the yard and felt something settle in his chest, like the last piece of a complex thing clicking into place. Elias, who was not a man given to displays of emotion, had red eyes when he put Hazel's hand in Cornelius's hand at the ceremony. He gripped Cornelius's arm briefly and hard before he stepped back, and that was all that needed to be said between them. The hands came to the celebration in their good shirts, and there was a table of food that Hazel and two women from neighboring ranches had spent 3 days preparing, and someone produced a fiddle, and someone else had a guitar, and the afternoon turned into an evening of music and dancing in the yard with the lamps lit along the porch rail, and the stars coming out above the Texas grass. Cornelius danced with his wife for the first time on that evening, and he was not a graceful dancer, which she had clearly already anticipated, and when he stepped on her foot and said sorry in a mortified voice, she put her forehead against his shoulder and laughed until he could feel it. "I will get better," he said. "You had better," she said against his shoulder, and then she straightened up and they kept dancing, badly and happily, and around them the night was warm and full of music. They moved into the bedroom at the front of the house that had been Elias and his wife's, because Elias had quietly moved himself to a smaller room at the back without making a ceremony of it, and this act of his was one of the most generous things Cornelius had ever seen a man do. He said so to Hazel on their wedding night, lying in the dark with her head on his shoulder and the window open to the September air. "He loves me," she said simply. "He wants me to have what he and my mother had." What did they have? She thought about it with the careful seriousness she brought to everything worth considering. They argued a great deal, she said, and they meant everything to each other. The two things were connected. She was the only person who could change his mind about anything, and he was the only person she ever needed to have changed it. "Is that what you want?" he asked. She lifted her head and looked at him in the dark. "I want someone who will hear me when I talk and argue with me when I am wrong and tell me the truth when it matters. I want a partner, not a decoration." "I can do all of that," he said. "I know you can," she said. "That is why I said yes." She put her head back on his shoulder, and the night settled around them, and Cornelius Wallace lay awake for a long time after she fell asleep, not from anxiety, but from a feeling that was too large and too good to sleep through immediately. The feeling of a man who has, for the first time in his life, arrived somewhere he intends to stay. The first year of their marriage was the kind that builds the foundation everything else rests on. It was not a soft year. The autumn of 1878 brought a dry spell that worried every rancher in the Panhandle, and Cornelius spent long days working with the hands to move cattle to the better-watered sections of the ranch and shore up the second water tank before winter. Hazel threw herself into the canning and preserving that would carry them through the cold months with the organized ferocity that she brought to anything she cared about. And the root cellar by November was so full that Cornelius had to turn sideways to walk through it. They argued for the first time in November. It was about money, specifically about whether to buy a second breeding bull from a rancher in Hemphill County who was selling out. And Hazel thought the price was too high for the current state of their reserves, and Cornelius thought the animal was worth it because good bloodlines paid back tenfold. They sat at the dining table with the ledger between them, and went at it with a thoroughness that would have frightened a person unfamiliar with the way two strong-minded people work toward truth. Elias, who had been sitting in the parlor pretending to read the newspaper, finally appeared in the doorway and said, "I am going to bed," and retreated with visible relief. They argued for another 40 minutes, and then Hazel pulled out a sheet of paper and did calculations that Cornelius had not thought to do, showing that if the spring grass came in well and they made the sale numbers they were projecting, they could absorb the cost of the bull and come out solvent. He looked at the numbers for a while and then said, "You are right." "I know," she said, "but you had a good reason to want him. The bloodline's argument was sound. The numbers' argument was sounder." "Yes," she said. "But you were not wrong to want the best animal, just wrong about the timing." He looked at her across the table with the feeling that had become familiar to him, the feeling of being actually known by another person. "All right," he said. "We wait on the bull." She closed the ledger. "Next spring, if the numbers hold, I will write to that man in Hemphill County." They bought the bull the following May, and he was worth every cent. Elias Mercer's health began to decline in the spring of 1879, slowly and then more noticeably by summer. He was still sharp in his mind and would have bristled mightily at anyone suggesting otherwise, but the physical work of the ranch, which he had never fully stepped back from despite having a foreman, became harder for him. His breathing was sometimes labored in the evenings, and he would sit on the porch after supper with a quiet that was different from his usual quiet. Hazel watched her father with the same directness she brought to everything, but there was a tenderness in it that Cornelius had not seen in her before, or perhaps had seen but not named. She sat with him on the porch in the evenings, and Cornelius often joined them, and the three of them would watch the sky over the Panhandle go through its evening changes, from gold to orange, to the deep bruised purple that comes just before the stars appear. Elias talked about the ranch's history in those evenings in a way he had not before, the way people do when they sense they are approaching the time when they will no longer be able to tell the stories themselves. He told them about buying the land in 1861, before the war had finished tearing the country apart, about how he had paid 7 cents an acre for what he had because nobody else had wanted that far north into the Panhandle, about how he and his wife Mary had driven out from East Texas in a wagon with their tools and their seed and Hazel not yet born, and built the first structure on the property with their own hands, a 2-room soddy that had eventually been replaced by the current house. She was not afraid of anything, he said of Mary. Not the weather, not the loneliness, not the work. There were nights that first winter when I thought I had made the worst decision of my life bringing her to that place, and she would look at me and say, "Elias, I came here on my own 2 feet, and I will stand on them." Hazel sat still and listened to her father talk about her mother, and Cornelius sat beside his wife and watched her face, and he thought about what it meant to build a life with someone in a wild and indifferent country and have it become the place you most wanted to be. "She would have liked you," Elias said to Cornelius one such evening. A simple statement, offered quietly, worth more than anything more elaborate. "I would have liked her," Cornelius said. And because he knew the woman through her daughter, he believed it. Elias died in January of 1880, on a cold, clear night when the stars over the Panhandle were impossibly bright and close. He had gone to sleep in his room after supper, and he did not wake in the morning, and the doctor who rode out from Amarillo said his heart had simply stopped. There were worse ways to go, he said, and he meant it kindly, and it was true. Hazel stood at her father's grave on a hillside near the creek where the cottonwoods grew, with Cornelius's arm around her shoulders, and she did not cry until after everyone else had gone. The hands had come, and the neighboring ranchers had ridden in, and the minister from Amarillo had said the right words, and all of it was proper and respectful, and then it was over, and it was just the two of them and the hill and the winter sky. Then she cried, and Cornelius held her and said nothing because there was nothing to say, and after a long time the crying stopped and she stood up straight and dried her face on the practical way she had, and she looked out over the ranch that was now hers and said, "He loved this land." "Yes," Cornelius said. "We will take care of it," she said. "Yes," he said again. She took his hand and they walked back down the hill together, and the ranch went on. They took care of it. The spring of 1880 was a good one, the grass coming in strong after the winter moisture, and the herd that Cornelius and Elias had spent 2 years building came into its own. They brought on 2 additional hands, experienced men from a neighboring outfit that had sold to a cattle company from Kansas, and the expanded crew made it possible to work the northeast section at full capacity for the first time. Hazel took over the formal management of the ranch accounts completely, and what had been her father's informal arrangement with the cattle buyers in Amarillo, she transformed into something more businesslike and considerably more favorable to the Mercer interests. The buyers came to understand fairly quickly that the woman at the Mercer Ranch was not going to be managed by charm or impatience, and after a few early attempts to do both, they settled into dealing with her straightforwardly, which was when the deals began to go well. Cornelius watched her in her element with frank admiration. She had a gift for the financial architecture of the operation that he knew he did not have himself, and he was not too proud to acknowledge it and be grateful for it. His gifts were in the field, in the reading of cattle and land and men, and they complemented each other in a way that made the operation stronger than either of them could have built alone. They were a partnership in the fullest sense, which was exactly what she had said she wanted on their wedding night, and he worked at it every day with the same seriousness he brought to the ranch, because he understood that what they had between them was a living thing that needed tending. In the late summer of 1880, Hazel told him one morning over coffee that she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen in the pre-dawn hour that was still theirs, the way she had told him almost everything important, quietly and directly, and then she watched him with those gray eyes to see what he would do with it. He set down his coffee cup very carefully and looked at her across the kitchen and said, "Are you all right?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I would tell you if I were not." "Yes," he said, because that was true. "I know you would." He got up from his chair and came around the table and put his arms around her from behind, and she put her hands over his where they crossed in front of her, and they stood there in the kitchen in the darkness before dawn, and neither of them said anything for a while because there was not a word that would improve on the moment. "Our child," he said finally, against her hair. "Our child," she agreed. The baby was born in April of 1881, a boy, large and loud and furious about his entry into the world, with a quantity of dark hair that the midwife said she had never seen on a newborn, and fists that gripped everything they were put near with startling determination. They named him Elias Mercer Wallace, for the grandfather he would never meet, and they called him Eli, and from the first hour of his life Cornelius was completely undone by him in the way that large, capable men are always undone by their very small children. He stood by the bed where Hazel lay exhausted and still fiercely present, holding the wrapped and sleeping baby, and he looked at the two of them, his wife and his son, with a feeling that had no name adequate to itself, a feeling that was larger than his capacity to contain it and that simply spread outward from him into the room and the spring morning outside the window. "He looks like you," Hazel said, watching him. "He has your forehead," Cornelius said. "He has your stubbornness." I could tell from the first hour. He looked up at her and smiled, the full unguarded smile that she had told him once, in the candid way she had, that she loved because it transformed his face. How do you know that already? Because he did not want to be born, she said. And then once he was, he did not want to stop telling us all about it. Cornelius laughed and sat down carefully on the edge of the bed, still holding the baby, and Hazel leaned against his shoulder, and the three of them were a family in that room on that April morning, and it was everything. Eli grew into a vigorous and opinionated child who wanted to go everywhere his father went from the moment he could walk, which he accomplished at 9 months with the same determined momentum that had characterized his birth. By the time he was 2, he was being set up on the saddle in front of Cornelius for short rides around the ranch yard, and his face in those moments had an expression of pure rapturous satisfaction that made Hazel stand on the porch with her arms folded, and her own face wearing an expression that Cornelius recognized as the one she reserved for things she loved without reservation. The ranch had grown. By 1882, they were running close to 600 head. The northeastern section was fully productive, and the reputation of the Mercer operation for reliable animals and honest dealing had spread through the regional network of buyers and ranchers that connected the Panhandle to the larger cattle market. Cornelius had hired a foreman of his own, a steady man named Thomas Rays, whose family had been ranching in the Texas Hill Country for 2 generations, and who had come north looking for land, and found instead a position that suited him precisely. With Thomas handling more of the day-to-day operation of the hands, Cornelius was able to think more broadly about the ranch's future, which increasingly occupied the conversations that he and Hazel had in the evenings after Eli was asleep. The cattle market was changing. The railroads were pushing south and west, and what had once been a matter of driving cattle north to the rails was becoming more complicated as the rail lines came to the cattle rather than the other way around. A depot was being seriously discussed for Amarillo, and if that happened, the economics of the operation would shift significantly. Hazel followed all of it through the newspapers that came in from Fort Worth and the letters she maintained with a cattle broker in Kansas City, who kept her informed of market movements, and the evenings when they sat together at the table with maps and papers spread between them were some of Cornelius's favorite times, the two of them building the future of their ranch out of information and argument, and the mutual respect that had only deepened over 4 years of genuine partnership. In the spring of 1883, the railroad arrived. Not exactly to Amarillo, but close enough that the difference was measured in hours rather than days, and the effect on the Panhandle cattle trade was as dramatic and rapid as everyone had predicted. The old trail drive model began to compress. Buyers who had previously required the cattle to come to them began to come to the cattle, or at least to the nearest rail siding. Cornelius had seen this change coming and had positioned the Mercer operation for it, and the year of 1883 was the most profitable year they had had since Elias' death. He sat with Hazel over the year-end accounts in January of 1884 and watched her work through the columns with her pencil, and the particular focused satisfaction she always had when numbers told a good story. "We can buy the Hendricks section," she said. The Hendricks section was 1,000 acres to the southeast that had become available when old George Hendricks had decided at 70 that he was done with ranching and had moved to live with his daughter in San Antonio. It was good grass, well watered, and it shared a long fence line with the Mercer property. "It is a good price," Cornelius said. He had already been over it twice and knew every acre of it. "It is a very good price," she said. "If we buy it, we will have the largest single holding in this part of the Panhandle." He looked at her across the table. "Is that what you want?" She thought about it in the careful way she had, not rushing to the answer. "I want the ranch to be secure," she said. "I want Eli to inherit something that will last, and I want room enough that if we have more children there is something for each of them." She paused, "but not so much that we cannot manage it well." "Your father told you about the man who stretched himself past his capacity." "He did," Cornelius said. He remembered the story. A rancher outside of Abilene who had bought everything he could, and then a drought had come and he had lost all of it. We will not stretch past our capacity. No, she said. The Hendricks section is inside our capacity. I have done the calculation several times. Then we will buy it, he said. She wrote the offer letter herself the next morning, and they rode to Amarillo together to send it by telegraph, which was a new thing in Amarillo and still carried a faint air of magic about it, that a message could move so fast over such a distance. They ate lunch in town at the hotel dining room, which was also a relatively new institution, and Cornelius watched his wife eat her meal and carry herself in the public room of the hotel with the same composed directness she brought to everything. And he thought, as he had thought many times over 6 years of marriage, that she was the most remarkable person he had ever known. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, catching his eye across the small table. "You," he said simply. She looked at him with a slight smile, the one that she saved for him in particular, that lifted one corner of her mouth and reached her eyes. "Elaborate," she said. "I am thinking that I would have missed you entirely," he said, "if I had ridden in a different direction or your father had hired a different man." "You would have found someone," she said. "No," he said, "I would not someone like you." She held his gaze, and the slight smile shifted into something fuller and more unguarded than she usually showed in public. "Well," she said, "it is a good thing you came from Tascosa." "It is the best thing I ever did," he said. And they finished their lunch and rode home to the ranch in the late afternoon light, side by side on the Panhandle Road, the way they did everything together. The Hendricks section was theirs by March. Thomas Ray's took on the supervision of the expanded range, with the methodical competence that had made him valuable, and Cornelius spent the spring moving cattle through the new sections and assessing where the improvements needed to be made. 2 additional hands were hired, a young man named Samuel who had come west from Georgia looking for work, and proved to be one of the best natural horsemen Cornelius had ever seen, and an older man called Decker whose history was somewhat murky, but whose work with the cattle was impeccable. Eli, who was 3 years old and deeply certain that he should be allowed to accompany every operation on the ranch regardless of its nature or complexity, absorbed the expansion of the property as an additional canvas for his endless explorations. He had his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair, and an energy that occasionally made both of his parents look at each other across the dinner table, with the speaking glance of 2 people who are deeply fond of something they are also deeply exhausted by. He found the second water tank, Hazel reported one afternoon in June, appearing in the barn doorway where Cornelius was working with Samuel on a harness repair. Cornelius looked up. "Found it how?" He walked to it, alone. "I turned around in the garden and he was not there, and I found his footprints in the dirt leading north." The second water tank was a 1/4 mile from the house. Eli was 3. Cornelius put down the harness. "Is he all right?" "He is perfectly fine and extremely pleased with himself," Hazel said. She had the expression that meant she was simultaneously furious and trying not to laugh, which was an expression he had come to recognize as specifically associated with their son. "He was sitting on the edge throwing pebbles into it when I found him." "I will have a talk with him," Cornelius said. "I already have," she said. "He told me the cattle know how to get there, so he did not see why he should not." Cornelius did not manage to keep a straight face, which Hazel noted with a pointed look. "You are not helping," she said. "I will talk to him," he said, not laughing mostly. "Tonight." "Thank you," she said, and turned back toward the house with the dignity of a woman who was winning most of the battles, even if this particular morning had gone to the 3-year-old. He talked to Eli that evening with as much seriousness as a man can bring to a conversation with someone who sits on his knee and pats his face with small sticky hands. And Eli listened with the appearance of absolute attention and the actual retention rate of approximately 40%, which Cornelius had determined was the boy's consistent ratio when told something he would prefer not to hear. But the wandering to the water tank did not happen again, which was what mattered. In the summer of 1884, Hazel told him she was expecting their second child, and this time there was no need for the careful watching of his face because he was across the kitchen and had his arms around her before she had finished the sentence, which made her laugh and say, "You already know I am perfectly well." "I know," he said. "Let me be glad without making it practical." "All right," she said, and she put her arms around him too, and the kitchen was warm with the summer morning. The second baby was born in February of 1885. A girl this time, born in the night during a windstorm that rattled the window frames and sent the coyotes into a frenzy out on the range. She was smaller than Eli had been, but no less determined, and she came into the world with a quieter intensity, looking around with dark eyes that already seemed to be assessing the situation with a calm she had clearly brought with her from wherever babies come from. They named her Clara, and from the first day of her life, her brother sat outside the bedroom door with his arms folded and the air of a person standing guard, which was so precisely like his father that Hazel reported it to Cornelius with an expression that was equal parts amusement and love. Eli was 4, old enough to understand that this small person was his sister, and young enough to take on the responsibility of that fact with a gravity that sat slightly comically on his round face. He showed her everything as soon as she was old enough to be carried to anything. He showed her the garden and the barn and the horses and the second water tank, which prompted a very particular look from both of his parents that he was too young to fully interpret, but that communicated something. The years moved the way good years do, with the weight of real life in them, the work and the worry and the small daily accumulation of ordinary moments that in memory arrange themselves into something that looks like happiness because that is what they were. The Mercer Ranch grew and thrived and established itself as one of the solid, respected operations of the Texas Panhandle. Cornelius became known among the ranching community not as an outsider who had come in and married into land, which is how some people will always choose to see such a thing, but as the man who had built the Mercer operation into what it became, which was more accurate. He and Hazel navigated the small vanities of local opinion with the equanimity of people who have too much to do to spend energy on other people's interpretations of their lives. There were people in the region who thought it unusual that a woman managed the accounts and participated as an equal in the decisions of the ranch, and there were people who thought it was exactly right, and the Mercers dealt with both kinds by simply continuing to do what worked. Eli started school in Amarillo in 1887, when he was 6 years old, and the town had grown enough to have a proper schoolhouse with a teacher who had been trained in Ohio, and had come west with the missionary conviction that the frontier needed education as much as it needed anything else. His name was Mr. Aldous, and he was young and earnest and slightly intimidated by the Panhandle wind, but he was a genuinely good teacher, and Eli, who had his mother's intelligence and his father's stubbornness about things he was interested in, took to reading the way he had taken to writing, with total commitment and no patience for limitations. Clara followed him to school 2 years later and distinguished herself immediately by correcting Mr. Aldous on a point of arithmetic, which caused a moment of complicated adjustment all around. And then Mr. Aldous, who was a good teacher in the way that good teachers are humble before the evidence of learning, gave her the harder problems and she was satisfied. In the evenings at the ranch house, the table was often covered with books alongside the ledgers and the ranch papers, and the family talked about what they were reading and what they were doing and what they intended, and the conversations had the lively quality of 4 people who genuinely liked each other as well as loved each other, which is a form of wealth that no drought or falling cattle price can touch. Cornelius had turned 40 in 1892, which he acknowledged with less ceremony than Hazel thought the occasion deserved, and she made up for by inviting the neighboring ranchers to a supper that he had known nothing about until he rode in from the range at evening to find 10 horses at the rail, and the house lit up and full of people. He had stood in the yard for a moment looking at the lit windows, and then he had looked at the woman who had come out onto the porch to watch him discover it, and the expression on her face, the mischief and the love mixed together in equal measure, was one of the things he knew he would carry with him for the rest of his life. "You planned this," he said. "I did," she said, entirely without apology. "You are terrible," he said. "I am wonderful," she said. "Come inside and eat something before Eli eats everything." He went inside and ate and talked with neighbors he had known for 14 years and felt the particular texture of a life that has become fully inhabited, all the rooms of it lived in and warm. The Cattlemen's Association that operated in the Panhandle had been a source of mixed feelings for Cornelius since the earliest days of his foreman work, when it had been clear that the larger outfits with more capital and more political connection had a structural advantage that the smaller and medium operations found difficult to counter. He had navigated it carefully over the years, building relationships where they were honest and avoiding entanglement where they were not, and the Mercer Ranch's position as a solid mid-size operation with excellent accounts had given them enough standing to be heard without being so prominent as to attract the attention of the larger interests. In 1893, there was a dispute over water rights along the creek that fed two of the Mercer tanks, and also served a newer, larger operation that had been established to the north by a cattle company out of St. Louis. The company's manager, a man named Burritt, had a habit of making claims with the assurance of someone who expected his assurance alone to settle matters. He came to the Mercer Ranch on a Tuesday morning in June with two of his men and the clear expectation of a short conversation. He found Hazel on the porch. "I need to speak to the owner of this property," Burritt said from his horse without dismounting. "You are," Hazel said. There was a pause while Burritt recalibrated. "I mean the man of the house. He is on the North Range," she said. "I am Hazel Wallace and I hold title to this property jointly with my husband. You may say what you came to say to me." Burritt said what he came to say, which was that his company intended to extend its water access along the creek and wanted the Mercer operation to adjust its intake accordingly. He said it in the way that men say things when they believe the saying is the deciding of it. Hazel listened with complete attention, and then she said, "The water rights on this section of the creek were established by grant in 1861 and registered with the county in 1863 and were registered in my name in 1880. I will have our attorney send you the documentation. Good morning, Mr. Burritt." Burritt looked at her for a long moment and then at his two men and then back at her, and then he turned his horse and rode out, which was the correct decision. Cornelius heard about it from Thomas Ray's when he came in from the North Range at midday, and he walked to the house and found Hazel at the table with the water rights documentation already pulled from the filing cabinet that she kept in the back room. "Burritt came," he said. "He did," she said. And I sent him the documents, and we will not hear from him again." She looked up at him with the steady certainty of someone who has already determined the outcome. "Would you like to see the water rights registration?" He sat down and looked at the documents, which were exactly as she described, comprehensive and clear, the kind of legal ground that no reasonable challenge could move. He looked at his wife across the documents and said, "I married well." "Yes," she said serenely. "You did." Burritt sent a letter 3 days later that was considerably more conciliatory than his personal visit had been. The water rights issue was settled without further contest. The summer of 1893 also brought news that the cattle market was beginning to feel the effects of the broader economic distress that was moving through the country that year, what the newspapers called a financial panic, the kind of disruption that starts in the banks and makes its way down through every level of commerce until it reaches the man with a herd he cannot sell at the price he needs. Cornelius and Hazel tracked it with the careful attention they brought to everything that affected the ranch, and they made decisions that were conservative and precise, holding back cattle that could be held back, moving those that needed to move at the best available prices, pulling back on planned improvements that could wait. It was a hard 2 years, 1893 and 1894, not devastating but lean, and it tested the soundness of what they had built in a way that ultimately confirmed it. They came through without loss of land or core herd, with their accounts strained but solvent, and when the market began to recover in 1895, the foundation they had maintained carefully through the difficult years let them move back into growth faster than neighbors who had cut more deeply. Eli was 14 in 1895 and had grown into a young man who had his father's build and his mother's mind, which was a combination that made the Panhandle ranching country take notice. He worked the ranch during the summers with a seriousness that belied his age and an instinct for cattle that Cornelius recognized because he had seen it in himself at the same age, the kind of reading of animals that is not taught but felt. He also read everything in the house and the school library and ordered additional books with his own saved wages, which made Thomas Rays call him the most educated cowboy in the Panhandle, which Eli took as the compliment it was intended to be. Clara at 10 was her own particular phenomenon, with her mother's precision and a creative intelligence that expressed itself in everything from the improvement of Hazel's garden layout to the arrangement of an elaborate system for cataloging the ranch's equipment inventory that she designed and presented to her parents with a formal seriousness that made Cornelius have to work very hard to maintain the appropriate gravity of response. "It is an excellent system," he said, reviewing the hand-drawn diagrams. "I know," Clara said. Hazel caught his eye over Clara's head, and the look they exchanged was the compressed language of long partnership, part amusement, part pride, part the shared recognition that they had produced something extraordinary. The turn of the decade into 1900 brought changes that were larger and faster than any of the previous changes had been. The railroad had fully arrived in Amarillo, which was now a proper town with brick buildings and a newspaper and hotels and commerce, the frontier giving way to something that looked more like permanent settlement. The cattle trade had professionalized in ways that would have seemed impossible to the man who had ridden into the Mercer yard in 1878, with telegraph lines and market reports, and the beginning of the kind of organized business infrastructure that would eventually transform ranching entirely. Cornelius and Hazel adapted as they had always adapted, with clear eyes and practical intelligence, and the willingness to change methods without changing principles. The Mercer Ranch remained what it had been, well-run, honestly managed, and cared for by people who understood that the land was the foundation of everything. Eli, 19 in 1900, had spent 2 seasons working cattle drives for neighboring outfits at his own request, wanting to see the country and test himself against it the way his father had. He came back from each one with the same seriousness and a slightly expanded sense of the world that Cornelius recognized from his own early years of range work. He was not restless the way some young men were, wanting to be anywhere but where they were. He was absorbing. He was preparing. In the spring of 1900, he came to his father and said he wanted to take on the management of the northeastern section as his own responsibility, not as a hired hand, but as a working partner in the enterprise. He had thought it out carefully, and he presented his case with the methodical thoroughness he had inherited from his mother, and Cornelius listened to every word of it and then said, "Have you talked to your mother?" "First," Eli said, "and she said to talk to you." Cornelius sat with it for a moment, this moment of a son asking to stand beside him rather than behind him, and he felt the fullness of it, all the years that had led here. The morning he had ridden onto this ranch with nothing but his skills and his character and the willingness to ask a woman for herself rather than waiting to be handed her. He looked at his son, 20 years the result of everything that decision had set in motion. "Yes," he said. Eli nodded, the same contained satisfaction his mother showed when things resolved correctly. Clara at 15 had decided with absolute finality that she intended to study law, which in 1900 was not an impossible ambition for a woman but was a formidable one. She had written letters to 3 schools in the East that had recently admitted women, and was compiling the documentation her applications would require with the same systematic efficiency she had brought to the ranch inventory at age 10. Hazel read every draft of every letter, and Cornelius sat up late on more than one occasion, going over legal documents that Clara had obtained from the county office, and was using to teach herself the structure of land rights and contract law. He was no lawyer, but he could recognize a precise and serious mind, and he gave her everything he had, which was his complete attention and his honest reaction, and he did not pretend that what she was attempting was not ambitious, because she did not want pretending, she wanted truth. She was her mother's daughter in that entirely. The spring of 1901 was when everything that had been building came together into what Cornelius would think of, in later years, as the fullest time of his life. The ranch was at the peak of what they had made it, running over 800 head on the expanded property, the accounts the best they had ever been, Eli taking on the northeastern section with a competence that felt like watching your own best self in a different generation. Clara had received an acceptance letter from a law school in Ohio that had been admitting women students for 3 years, and the evening they read it at the supper table there were 4 people crying with different expressions about it. Hazel with bright eyes and a composed face, Cornelius with no pretense at composure whatsoever, Eli with the specific emotion of an older brother watching his sister achieve what she had aimed for, and Clara herself with the expression of someone who has known something would happen and is nonetheless moved by the fact of it. On a May evening of that year, 1901, Cornelius walked with Hazel to the hill above the creek where Elias Mercer was buried, a walk they took together on certain evenings, particularly when there was something worth reporting to the old man. The cottonwoods were in full leaf, the creek running clear from the spring rains, the grass on the slope the particular vivid green of early summer. They stood at Elias' grave as they often did, simply standing, letting the place be what it was. A meadowlark was singing somewhere in the grass below them. The sun was low and golden over the wide flat land. He would have loved all of it, Hazel said. He would have told me I should have handled the Burritt situation myself, Cornelius said, and then he would have admitted you handled it better. She laughed, the full laugh that she gave freely with him and with the children, the sound that had become one of the essential sounds of his world. He would have done exactly that. Cornelius looked at her in the evening light, this woman who had been his partner and his love, and his best argument for the idea that a person could build a life that was genuinely worth having. 23 years since he had walked into her garden with his hat in his hand. 23 years of morning coffee and evening arguments and the kind of love that is not a single sustained feeling but a daily decision, made again and again in all the small moments that add up to a life. I would do it all the same, he said. Every bit of it. She looked back at him and took his hand, the way she had that first afternoon in the garden, and she held it with the same certainty, the certainty of a woman who has always known her own mind and has never once regretted the choice she made. So would I, she said. The meadowlark went on singing in the grass below them. The light moved across the land. They stood on the hill above the creek in the full summer evening, with the grave of the man who had built it all at their feet and the ranch spreading out below them, full and thriving and theirs. They walked back down the hill together in the long horizontal gold of the May evening, the same way they had walked back from that hill on the winter morning when they had buried Elias together, the way they did everything. The lights of the ranch house came on below them one by one, and through the kitchen window they could see the outline of Eli moving around, and presently the smell of coffee came up the evening air, because their son knew what time his parents came back from the hill and had put the pot on. They came into the kitchen to find Eli at the stove and Clara at the table with a law textbook, not yet gone to Ohio, but getting ready to go, filling every available hour with preparation. The kitchen was warm and smelled of coffee, and the remains of supper, and there was a lamp on the table and the sound of the Panhandle wind in the eaves above them, the same wind that had been here before any of them and would be here long after. Cornelius poured 2 cups of coffee and carried them to the table and sat down beside his wife, and she opened the book she had been reading, and he sat back in his chair and looked at the kitchen full of his family and thought of the man he had been when he rode in from Tascosa with nothing but his skills and his character and the decision, when it came to it, to ask the woman himself. It had turned out to be the most important thing he ever did. Clara looked up from the textbook and said, "Papa, does this mean that the water rights registration in 1863 would have precedent over a later easement claim?" He leaned forward and looked at the page she was pointing to. "Yes," he said. "Your mother could explain the specifics better than I can." Hazel reached over and pulled the textbook toward her, and Clara moved her chair closer, and Eli brought the coffee pot to the table and sat down too, because there was nothing better than this. There was simply nothing better in the world than this. The 4 of them around the table in the lamplight with the Panhandle night around them, and the ranch solid and breathing outside the walls. Later, after Eli and Clara had gone to bed and the house was quiet, Cornelius and Hazel sat on the front porch in the 2 chairs that had been there as long as the porch had, the chairs that had been Elias and Mary's and were now theirs. The stars over the Panhandle were doing what they always did, filling the sky with an extravagance of light that would never stop being remarkable regardless of how many nights a person had spent under it. "Clara will be all right in Ohio," Hazel said. "She will be more than all right," he said. "She will run the place within 2 years." Hazel smiled at the stars. "Probably." "Eli is ready," Cornelius said. "More than ready." "I know," she paused. "It is strange, when the children you have built everything toward begin to be the ones building. Good strange or bad strange?" She considered it in the thoughtful way she had. "Both," she said. "Mostly good." He reached out in the dark and found her hand on the arm of her chair, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat in the dark with the stars above them and the ranch around them and 23 years of a life together settled in them like bedrock. "I am glad I came from Tascosa," he said. She turned her head to look at him in the starlight, the woman who had watched him from the kitchen window on his first day with flour on her hands and fire in her gray eyes, who had told him where to walk in her garden and how to take his coffee, and that she was not the kind of woman who responded well to being pursued in a roundabout fashion, who had said yes to him in the June light between the bean rows and meant every syllable of it for every year since. "So am I," she said. The stars turned above the Panhandle. The grass moved in the warm night wind. The ranch breathed in the dark around its fences, full of animals and growing things, and the years of careful work that had made it what it was. Inside the house their children slept, and outside on the porch the 2 of them sat together in the deep, comfortable silence of people who know each other entirely, and have no need to fill the quiet with anything other than what it is, which is love in its most enduring form, the kind that is not an event but a direction. A decision made once in a June garden and then made again every morning since. In coffee cups and ledger books and arguments about bull prices and dances in the yard and children who carry forward everything you were and become more than you imagined. Cornelius Wallace had ridden onto the Mercer Ranch with dust on his boots and honest work in his eyes, and he had been offered something he declined to take, and instead he had gone to the garden and asked for himself. And the rest of it, all of this, every acre and every morning and every year of it, had come from that one right decision. He held his wife's hand under the Texas stars and felt the rightness of it settle through him like deep water, and he would not have changed a single thing.